Have you ever experienced something so terrifying that it made you question your own reality? Imagine, for just a moment, glancing into a mirror and seeing something wrong. Not just your reflection, something else. Something that moves on its own. Something that seems to know you better than you know yourself. Welcome to Sinister Stories, where today we bring you a real-life account so chilling it will make you think twice before you look into a mirror again. In this story, a young woman faces her own reflection, only to realize that what's staring back at her has a mind of its own. It doesn't just reflect her, it's mocking her, smiling in a way that no reflection should. What would you do if you found yourself trapped in that situation? Would you scream, run, or would you dare to confront what lies behind the glass? This isn't fiction. This is a real story, told by someone who lived it, and it's about to leave you breathless with fear. As the terror in this tale unfolds, you'll be pulled deeper into the mystery, and the thin line between reality and nightmare will begin to blur. Before we dive into this chilling experience, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Stories, and share it with anyone brave enough to hear it. Now, let's begin. It all started on a quiet afternoon, in a seemingly ordinary living room, where everything felt just a little too calm. The story takes place in an old, creaky house that has stood for decades, weathered by time, its walls steeped in whispers of forgotten memories. The house always had an unsettling atmosphere, but on this particular day, something felt off, more than usual. The afternoon was quiet, unnaturally so. No birds chirping outside, no hum of distant cars, just a suffocating stillness that hung heavy in the air. My aunt sat on the worn-out sofa in the living room, an antique piece passed down through generations. Its faded fabric sagged beneath her, as if tired from holding too many secrets. The living room was dimly lit, with long shadows creeping across the floor, giving the room an almost haunted feel. Next to the sofa, there was a large mirror, an ornate relic from another era, its frame carved with strange, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and twist in the low light. The mirror had always been there, a silent observer to the room, but today, it seemed to emanate an eerie presence. The house was quiet except for the distant clinking of her parents cooking in the kitchen. The scent of onions sizzling in the pan filled the air, a mundane reminder of reality, but something about that mirror seemed to draw her attention, pulling her gaze toward it as if it was demanding to be noticed. As she lay there, her eyes drifted toward the mirror, reflecting not only the room but the deepening sense of unease that had begun to creep up her spine. At first, it was nothing more than her own image staring back at her, a young girl, tired from a long day, resting quietly. But there was something unnerving about the way the reflection seemed too still, too perfect. It captured the room in exact detail, yet there was an undeniable sense of wrongness in the air. The longer she stared, the more the room around her seemed to shrink, and the only thing that felt real was that reflection, watching her waiting. The heavy silence began to throb, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the tension in the room thickened like fog. Then the room began to feel colder. Not just a draft or a slight chill, but a biting cold that seeped into her bones, as though the warmth was being drained from the room itself. Her breath caught in her throat, and the once familiar house now felt alien, as if she were no longer safe. The shadows grew longer, darker, and more oppressive, almost as if they were alive, curling toward the mirror, as though drawn to it. She could no longer shake the feeling that she was not alone, that the mirror was not just an object reflecting her, but a portal, a gateway to something wrong, something watching her from the other side. At first, everything seemed normal, too normal. My aunt shifted her position slightly, her arm lazily draping over the edge of the couch, her body mirrored perfectly by the image in the glass. But then, something subtle changed. As she blinked, her reflection didn't. It was a fleeting moment, so brief that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But the uneasiness settled deeper in her stomach. She blinked again, this time deliberately, but her reflection once again remained still, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring back at her as if it was waiting for something. Her heart began to pound, each beat echoing in her ears as the silence of the house grew louder, more oppressive. She sat up straighter, her pulse quickening, but still, her reflection did not move. It stayed frozen in its place on the couch, its eyes locked on hers, like a predator stalking its prey. She waved her hand in front of her face, testing the reflection. Nothing. The figure in the mirror remained perfectly still, as if it was a photograph, a lifeless image of herself that no longer obeyed the natural laws of the world. As panic started to claw its way into her chest, she forced herself to breathe, telling herself it was just her imagination. But then the reflection moved, on its own. A slow, deliberate movement, the corners of its mouth curling upward into a sickening, unnatural smile. It wasn't her smile. It was wrong, stretched too wide, too slow, like it was trying to mimic her but didn't quite understand how. The coldness in the room intensified, and her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, not just from the mirror, but from everywhere. She could feel it now, an unsettling awareness that her reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something that had taken her shape, but was not her. Her chest tightened, and the room seemed to darken around her as the reflection's smile grew broader, its eyes gleaming with an eerie, malicious light. And then, as if it was mocking her fear, the reflection raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and waved at her. But she hadn't moved at all. It was as though the reflection had become a separate entity, aware of her terror, feeding off it, enjoying every second of her horror. The once familiar mirror had become a portal to something far more sinister, something that should not exist, and now she was trapped in its gaze. She felt her limbs grow heavy with dread, her breath quickening as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to get up and run, but she couldn't move, frozen in the face of the unexplainable terror that now stood smiling back at her from beyond the glass. As the reflection continued to smile, a sinister mockery of her own face, my aunt's mind raced with fear and confusion. Her body felt paralyzed, as if the air itself had thickened around her, trapping her in place. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to run out of the room, but something deeper, something primal, told her that she needed to understand what was happening. Was it a trick of her mind, a hallucination, or had she crossed some invisible boundary between the normal and the unnatural? She didn't know, but the longer she stared, the more the reflection seemed to take on a life of its own, no longer just a passive image, but something with purpose, something that wanted her attention. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew she had to make a decision. She could pretend this wasn't happening, close her eyes, and hope that when she opened them, everything would be back to normal. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be. She could sense that whatever was in that mirror wasn't going to leave her alone. Or worse, it might follow her. The thought of that thing escaping the glass, crossing over into her world, sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she weighed her options. If she ran, she might never know what was truly lurking on the other side of the mirror. But if she stayed, the fear that gripped her might become something far more dangerous. The reflection's smile widened, as if it knew her thoughts, as if it could sense the battle raging inside her. It waved again, a slow, deliberate motion that sent icy tendrils of dread curling around her heart. Her body ached to move, but her legs felt rooted to the floor, her gaze locked with the twisted reflection that stared back at her with malevolent intent. Then, in an act of desperation, she decided. She had to confront it. She had to know. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, she leaned forward, inching closer to the mirror. Her reflection mirrored her at first, moving in unison, but then, halfway through, it stopped. It stayed frozen while she continued to move, its smile fading into something darker, something hungry. Her reflection's eyes gleamed with a strange light, as if it were waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that it felt like it might burst, but she couldn't stop now. She was too close. In that moment, She realized she had crossed a line, a point of no return. Whatever was on the other side of that mirror was no longer content to remain just a reflection. It was something far more sinister, something that wanted out. And now, with her so close, it had the chance to reach her. A chill ran down her spine as she braced herself for what was to come, knowing that she had willingly stepped into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The air around her felt electric, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. As she inched closer to the mirror, her reflection no longer followed her movements. It just sat there grinning, its eyes darker now, hollow, like black pits staring into her soul. And then, as if in response to her proximity, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath formed mist in front of her face, and the once familiar warmth of her home was replaced by an unbearable cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight, constricted by the overwhelming fear gripping her. Something terrible was about to happen. In an instant, the reflection's smile twisted into a grotesque snarl, the kind that sent primal terror coursing through her veins. It stood up. Her reflection stood, even though she hadn't moved. It leaned forward, pressing its hands against the other side of the glass, its eyes never leaving hers. The room seemed to tilt, reality itself bending as the figure inside the mirror began to shift. Slowly, horrifyingly, its movements became jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. It raised its hand and dragged its fingers down the inside of the mirror, creating a sound like nails on a chalkboard that reverberated through her skull. The mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting the image, and for a moment, she saw something beyond, something far more terrifying than just her twisted reflection. Behind the glass was a dark, endless void, filled with shadows that writhed and flickered like flames. And within that void, she could make out shapes, figures moving, watching, waiting. They were silent, but their presence was deafening, suffocating her in a sea of dread. Her reflection's face continued to contort, its mouth stretching wider and wider until it was an inhuman, gaping maw, as if it were preparing to devour her. She backed away, finally tearing her eyes from the mirror. But it was too late. The thing inside had noticed her fear. It thrived on it. As she stumbled back, the reflection raised its hand, pressing it harder against the glass, the surface warping as though it were no longer solid. A distorted, garbled voice came from the mirror, echoing in the room, though its lips did not move. It spoke her name in a way that made her blood run cold, as if it had been watching her for far longer than she had ever realized. The sound was low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth, and it sent shivers down her spine. The room darkened further, the shadows deepening as the boundaries between the world she knew and the one behind the glass began to blur. She could feel it now, something pulling her toward the mirror, drawing her in as if the reflection wanted to drag her into that dark void. Her limbs felt heavy, like lead, her body resisting her every attempt to move. The reflection began to laugh, a horrible, distorted sound that echoed in her ears, and the mirror started to crack, the fractures spreading like spiderwebs across the glass. The thing in the mirror was coming for her. She had crossed the threshold, and now there was no escape. The cracks in the mirror grew wider, and through them, she saw the shapes in the void reaching out, their hands clawing at the edges, trying to pull themselves through. Her reflection was no longer just a reflection. It had become something else entirely, something evil, something hungry, and it wanted her. As the mirror's surface continued to crack, the air around her grew thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. She could hear it now, the sound of whispering voices echoing from behind the glass, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't speaking any language she recognized, but their intent was clear: malice, hunger, desperation. The thing on the other side of the mirror was not just her reflection. It was something far more ancient, something far more sinister. It had been watching her, waiting for this moment to break free, to step into her world and take her place. Suddenly, the reflection's hand shot through the glass. The sound of the mirror shattering was deafening, and shards flew in every direction, glinting in the dim light like jagged teeth. But instead of falling to the ground, the shards seemed to hover in the air, suspended, as if time itself had fractured along with the glass. Her reflection's hand, now grotesque and twisted, reached out toward her, its fingers impossibly long and thin, the skin a sickly, grayish hue. The smile on its face was no longer just eerie, it was predatory. It wanted to pull her into the dark, endless void behind it. In a moment of pure terror, she realized the truth. This wasn't just a reflection gone wrong. The thing in the mirror wasn't her. It was a copy, a dark doppelganger that had been waiting for its chance to escape. The stories she had heard, the legends about reflections being gateways to another world, suddenly felt all too real. This thing had been trapped in the mirror for who knows how long, mimicking her every move, learning her habits, and now it had found a way to break through. But more than that, it wanted to replace her. It wanted to pull her into its world of shadows and take her place in hers. The room seemed to spin as her mind struggled to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. The hand from the mirror inched closer, the fingers stretching out toward her face. She could feel the cold radiating from them, an unnatural chill that seemed to sap the strength from her limbs. Her body screamed at her to run, but she was frozen in place, paralyzed by the realization that this wasn't just a haunting, this was a takeover. If she didn't stop it now, it would drag her into that other world, and no one would ever know. It would walk in her skin, live her life, and she would be lost forever in the dark. The reflection's voice echoed in the room again, a distorted, hollow version of her own. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice seeping into her mind like poison. "We are the same. I've been waiting for you." Her heart raced as the darkness behind the mirror seemed to grow, swallowing the edges of the room, pulling her closer to the cold, black void. The cracks in the mirror widened, the last barrier between her and whatever lived in that twisted, nightmarish world. She felt herself slipping, the pull of the void growing stronger with each passing second. But then, something shifted inside her, a sudden surge of adrenaline. She had come this far, too far to let it take her. Summoning every ounce of strength, she lunged backward, away from the mirror, just as the reflection's fingers brushed against her cheek, cold and sharp like ice. She stumbled, her heart pounding in her chest, as the reflection's face twisted in fury. The mirror trembled violently, the cracks spreading further, and for a split second, she saw beyond the reflection. She saw a world of endless darkness, filled with twisted figures like her reflection, doppelgängers, trapped, waiting for their chance to escape. And she knew, with sickening certainty, that they had been watching, waiting for someone like her to fall into their trap. The mirror's surface finally shattered completely, the reflection vanishing in a burst of glass and darkness. The room plunged into silence. The oppressive cold lifted, and the shadows that had stretched across the walls retreated, leaving her standing alone, breathless, her heart still racing. The mirror was gone, reduced to a pile of broken shards on the floor, but she knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been on the other side of that glass was still out there, waiting, watching, searching for another way back. The room was deathly still, except for the faint sound of her own ragged breathing. The mirror lay shattered at her feet, shards scattered across the floor, each one reflecting distorted fragments of the room, fragments of herself. She wanted to believe that it was over, that the nightmare had ended with the destruction of the mirror, but the silence felt too heavy, too unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Her skin still prickled with the memory of the cold, the voice of her reflection echoing in her mind. Asterisk, we are the same. I've been waiting for you. Asterisk, the words chilled her to the bone, leaving her to wonder if they had truly gone, or if something far worse had just begun. She took a shaky step back, her heart still pounding in her chest, and glanced around the room, half expecting the reflection to reappear, clawing its way out of the darkness. But all she saw were the broken pieces of the mirror, each fragment gleaming dully in the dim light, mocking her with their fractured reflections. She was safe. At least, that's what she told herself. Yet, the room felt different now, as if the fabric of reality had thinned. The barrier between her world and that shadowy other place stretched too thin. The oppressive sense of being watched lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there, hiding in the cracks of reality, waiting for the right moment to resurface. She stared at the shards, hoping to see only her own reflection, but the memories of what had just happened flashed before her eyes. Her reflection's twisted smile, its unnatural movements, the way it had tried to pull her into that other world. Her body trembled as she remembered the hand reaching for her, its cold fingers brushing against her skin. The marks it left weren't visible, but she could still feel them, like a stain on her soul. Days passed, but the terror never left her. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a prison, a place where the veil between worlds had been torn open. Every time she walked past a reflective surface, her heart skipped a beat. She could no longer look into a mirror without feeling that creeping dread, the fear that her reflection might not behave the way it should. She avoided them as much as possible, covering them with sheets or simply turning them around. But it didn't matter. The feeling followed her everywhere, an invisible presence lurking just behind her, watching, waiting for her to let her guard down. Sleep became impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the reflection again, its sinister smile, its cold, black eyes staring into hers. She dreamed of that other world, the one beyond the glass, filled with those shadowy figures. They beckoned to her, whispering her name, calling her to join them. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her pulse racing, convinced that she could hear the whispering still echoing in her room. It was as though the thing in the mirror had left its mark on her, a part of it forever connected to her, no matter where she went. One night, she woke to find herself standing in front of the small mirror in her bedroom. She had no memory of how she had gotten there. Her reflection stared back at her, perfectly still, perfectly normal. But she couldn't trust it, not anymore. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, and touched the cold glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as she turned away, she saw it, a flicker in the corner of her eye. Her reflection, smiling. Not the normal smile of relief, but that smile, the same twisted, malevolent grin she had seen in the shattered mirror. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, her heart thudding in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as she realized the horrifying truth. The reflection was still there, still watching. It had never left. No matter how far she ran, no matter how many mirrors she avoided, it was always there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the moment when the veil between their worlds would thin again. And this time, it wouldn't stop until it pulled her through. The mirror was broken, but the terror was far from over. Months have passed since the night the mirror shattered, but the memory of that twisted reflection still haunts her every waking moment. My aunt tries to return to normal, to piece her life back together, but she can't escape the feeling that something is horribly, irreparably wrong. The world around her has lost its sense of safety, its familiarity. Everyday moments are now tinged with dread, and the boundary between the real and the unreal has become blurred. She avoids mirrors altogether now, but it doesn't help. It's as if the reflection, the thing that once smiled at her from behind the glass, has seeped into every shadow, every dark corner of her life. Her nights are plagued by nightmares, dreams where she's pulled back to that moment in front of the mirror. In these dreams, she watches herself from behind the glass, a silent observer, trapped in the dark void beyond. She sees her reflection standing in her place, living her life, smiling at her friends and family, while she is helpless to stop it. The worst part is that the people around her don't notice the change. They talk to the reflection, laugh with it, unaware that the person they love is no longer the same. It's not her, it's something else wearing her face. These dreams leave her shaken, drenched in sweat, her heart racing with the unmistakable sense that the dreams are more than just nightmares. They feel like warnings, like glimpses into another reality, one where the thing in the mirror succeeded in taking her place. Sometimes, she wakes in the dead of night and swears she hears faint whispers coming from the walls, murmurs that sound like her own voice, but slightly off, slightly wrong. The whispers speak in a tone that makes her blood run cold, telling her that it's not over, that the reflection is still waiting, watching, biding its time. Even in the daylight, the feeling of being watched never leaves her. She'll catch glimpses of movement in the corners of her vision, quick flashes of her own form disappearing around corners or reflected in windows. Her mind is constantly on edge, questioning reality, wondering if what she's seeing is real or just a trick of her traumatized imagination. She's not sure anymore. Every surface that holds a reflection, windows, puddles, even polished floors, feels like a gateway to the other side, to that dark place where her doppelganger still waits, hungry for another chance. The toll on her psyche is undeniable. Friends and family have noticed the change. They tell her she looks tired, that her once vibrant personality has dimmed. They don't understand the weight she carries, the constant fear that at any moment, the reflection might return, clawing its way back into her life. She tries to explain it, but how can she? How do you tell someone that you're afraid of your own reflection, that you can't trust the face staring back at you in the mirror? People would think she's crazy. Maybe she is. But deep down, she knows the truth. The thing in the mirror wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Her only solace comes from knowing that she's not alone. She's since found others who've experienced similar horrors, people who've seen their reflections behave in ways they shouldn't, people who felt that same unsettling presence lurking behind the glass. They share their stories in hushed tones, afraid of drawing too much attention to their experiences, afraid of tempting fate. But the stories are all the same: twisted reflections, dark doppelgangers, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. As the days pass, the whispers in the dark grow louder. My aunt can feel it. The boundary between her world and that other place is thinning again. She knows that the thing in the mirror is still out there, and it's only a matter of time before it tries to break through once more. The thought terrifies her, but what terrifies her even more is the possibility that, next time, it might succeed. And when it does, no one will ever know. No one will be able to tell the difference between her and the thing that smiles so coldly, so perfectly, from behind the glass. The story ends with a chilling realization. The terror hasn't ended. It never really does. It lingers, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when we least expect it. So, the next time you glance into a mirror, be careful. Watch closely, because the reflection staring back at you might not just be a reflection. It might be something much darker, something waiting for its chance to take your place. Don't forget to subscribe to Sinister Stories for more tales that will make you question what's real and what's lurking just beyond your reflection. If you've had a similar experience, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. But whatever you do, be careful where you look, because the next time, it might be your reflection that doesn't look away.